Hi, hello, and welcome everyone to Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History, Research, and Conversation Program, sponsored by the Roundhouse Foundation. My name is, of course, Mariah Rocker, and I am your host for this evening. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your day with us. We're coming to you live on the Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages. If you can't stick around for the whole show, you'll be able to find this and every previous episode of Black History Quest on the Oregon Black Pioneers YouTube page. But before we get started, what is Oregon Black Pioneers? We are, of course, Oregon's only nonprofit dedicated to preserving and promoting the experiences of people of African descent statewide. We illuminate this seldom told history through a variety of ways, including books that you can buy on our website, lesson plans that you can download for free on our website, exhibits that we showcase throughout the state and also have online versions of on our website, and programs like this one. So make sure to check out OregonBlackPioneers.org for more information about the work that we're doing. Now, this is our 6th episode of Black History Quest. For those who are checking in for the first time, here's what it's all about. We've recruited several talented researchers to serve as our history investigators, and we shared with them some of the materials in OBP's research files. These sources might be objects, photographs, newspaper clippings, or correspondence. But no matter what the material is, it definitely has a story to tell. And we want to know what that story is. That's why I think we're all here tonight. So, over the past several months, each of them have been digging into the stories behind these sources and preparing a presentation on what they found. And every other month, we gather here to reconnect with our history investigators and find out what it is that they were able to uncover. After they present, we'll take a moment to have a chat to discuss their findings in more detail. So make sure to leave your questions in the chat section of the live stream so that we can discuss them on air. So without further ado, let's actually get started with tonight's program. I am so thrilled to be able to welcome Larry Landis as our history investigator. Larry Landis is the retired director of Oregon State University, of Oregon State University's Special Collections and Archives Research Center. He actually worked as an archivist at OSU for nearly 30 years. So he's definitely an expert in the material that we're about to be diving into. He's actually currently a co-instigator of the Letitia Carson Legacy Project, which honors the story and legacy of Letitia Carson, an early Black resident of Oregon. Oregon Black Pioneers is one of the partner organizations in that project. So if you're a fan of ours, you might also be a fan of Letitia, as we all definitely are. Now, Larry is also an advisory member of the Oregon Heritage Commission, representing higher education. He serves on the Oregon Encyclopedia editorial board, on the Oregon Century Farm and Ranch Program Management Committee, and on the board of the Benton County Historical Society, where he's also a volunteer. So Larry's definitely keeping himself busy, even though he's retired. I've had the pleasure of working with Larry through the Letitia Carson Legacy Project almost the entire time that I personally have been with Oregon Black Pioneers. So I can definitively say that he is truly an incredible wealth of knowledge. I am so glad that we get to share him as a resource with all of you today. So that's your welcome, Larry. Hello.
Hello, Mariah, and thank you so much for that warm and wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you in our audience who have logged in and are online and participating in this hopefully interesting discussion.
Yes, good call. Thank you to the audience as well. We are very happy that you're joining us tonight. But yeah, thank you, Larry. So, as you know, all Black History Quest investigations begin with a source that sparked an interest. And I know that you're going to talk to us about that, but do you mind taking just a brief second to tell us what the source is that you were looking into and why it specifically caught your attention for this project?
Well, it was a newspaper article that one of my faculty at the Special Collections and Archives Research Center gave to me in early 2020. And it was a little clipping from the Advocate newspaper, Portland's Black news, newspaper for its Black community in the early 20th century. And it listed 5 students who indicated that they were home from Oregon Agricultural College, which was Oregon State University's name in the 1920s. They were home for Thanksgiving. And I was aware of one of the students, Carrie Halsell, but I was not aware of the others. And that led me into uh, doing a little bit of digging at that point in time as to who these students were. I mean, I recognized a
Mm.
couple of the names as prominent families, but I wanted to know more. And then COVID
Sure,
hit, and I kind of put it aside.
that makes sense. And then it sounds like we were able to make it work for both of us so that we could learn a little bit more about this interesting pocket of Black history in Oregon. And you had a reason to dive back into that
Oh
research.
yeah. Well, it's always been in the back of my mind, and
Sure.
I am so thrilled that I've had this opportunity to delve back into this research and find out more about the seven students,
Mm,
and really, I think the reason and cause behind them to come to Oregon Agricultural College.
that totally makes sense. Yeah. So, what sort of questions did you want to were you hoping to like answer what as you did this research?
Well, since I had only known about one of the seven students, se- with there being seven, I thought in the 1920s there had to be a catalyst or an
Mm,
influence or somebody or something that guided them to Oregon Agricultural College. That was the primary question that I wanted to answer. And
sure.
I think I found the answer, and that's what I want to
Okay.
share. That's what I want to share tonight.
Perfect. Okay. Well, that's so great. Did
Yeah.
you have a little bit more you wanted
Oh, I was
to
just going to
weave
say,
into it?
and of course, I want to share some information about the seven students as well.
Mm,
They have some interesting stories, and they need to be told.
yeah. You want to help bring those stories to light. So, so
Exactly.
glad that you're here to do that. I know that I'm definitely excited to learn more, especially to find out the answer to the question. Love it when you're able to actually find the answer. So that's we're off to a great start. But yeah, since we're all so excited to learn more, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to present. So take it away, Larry.
All right. Thank you, Mariah. In 2002, Oregon State University opened its first new residence hall in nearly 30 years. Halsell Hall was constructed to honor Carrie Beatrice Halsell, a student from Salem who had graduated from Oregon Agricultural College, now Oregon State University, in 1926. She had been identified as OAC's first Black graduate by a reporter for the Daily Barometer, OSU's student newspaper, who researched the topic in the late 1990s. However, about 6 years ago, I determined that an earlier Black student, Palmer Patton, had attended Oregon Agricultural College from 1916 to 1920, earning bachelor's and master's degrees in agriculture in 1918 and 1920. It is probable that as a student, Patton identified as and passed for white. OAC has had a handful of other students of color prior to Patton, including students of indigenous Japanese and Chinese ancestry, as well as international students from Pacific Rim countries in India. But because Oregon was generally perceived as hostile to people of color in the late 19th and early 20th century, OEC was probably not seen as an institution that would be accepting of Black students. In the course of researching Palmer Patton, thanks to the significant increase in newspaper content available online through platforms such as the University of Oregon's Historic Oregon Newspapers, I also learned more about Carrie Hall, so in particular, that she was one of seven Black students who attended Oregon Agricultural College between 1922 and 1931. One of my faculty at OSU's Special Collections and Archives Research Center, Natalia Fernandez, had discovered this 1924 article in The Advocate, which I mentioned as being Portland's Black newspaper, which was published from 1903 to 1936. This article mentions five of the seven students who attended OAC between 1922 and 1931. And then this raised the question in my mind, was there a catalyst such as an influential person or organization that resulted in this small but significant cohort of students enrolling at OAC during a volatile period in Oregon's history? especially given the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Oregon and other states in the early 1920s. And this is the premise that we will explore this evening. First, I'd like to introduce the students to you so you know a little bit about them before we delve into the research question. These are their portraits, and they're from various high school and OSU Beaver yearbooks. And starting from the upper left, we have Carrie Halsall, who graduated from Salem High School in 1921 and entered OAC in the fall of 1922 studying commerce. She was born in Boulder, Colorado in 1903, and her family moved to Salem sometime between 1910 and 1915. Next is Othita Nichols, a 1922 graduate of Portland's High School of Commerce, and she also entered OAC in the fall of 1922 as a commerce major. On the top right is Jenny Dora Grayson, who entered OAC in the spring of 1923 after graduating from the High School of Commerce in January of that year. She also began as a commerce major, but soon changed to home economics. Next is Idra Williams on the bottom left, graduated from Portland's Jefferson High School in 1923 and entered OAC also as a commerce major in the fall of 1923. Next is Richard Bogle, who is from one of Portland's most prominent Black families, and he graduated from Franklin High School in 1924 and entered OAC in the fall of 1924 as a pharmacy major. Next is Maxine Maxwell, who graduated from Salem High School in 1927 and entered OAC as a pharmacy major in the fall of 1928. And finally, Delia Coleman, who entered OAC in the fall of 1928 as a sophomore. She was from Alabama and had received a high school equivalent degree in home economics from the Tuskegee Institute in 1920. Her father had been born into slavery in 1860. Delia took college-level courses at the Hampton Institute and Kansas State Agricultural College in the early and mid-1920s and worked for Tuskegee as a home economics education supervisor in 1926 and 1927. We don't know what brought her to Oregon Agricultural College. Perhaps someone at Kansas State with connections to the college, which at the time had one of the nation's most highly regarded home economics programs. Perhaps that person had suggested OAC to her. Later in the presentation, we'll learn more about these students, particularly their time at OAC and where life took them afterward. But back to the premise. As I began to explore more about the 7 students, I realized some commonalities. The mothers of Jenny Dora Grayson, Richard Bogle, and Othita Nichols were involved in the Rosebud Study Club, which was a subsidiary of the Oregon Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. Some had parents involved with the Portland NAACP chapter. The 5 women from Portland and Salem were accomplished musicians, all of them having studied piano and/or vocal music. One of the keys to all of this was that the students were often mentioned in The Advocate in relation to their time at OAC. As I have mentioned, The Advocate was a newspaper for Portland and Oregon's Black communities that was published from 1903 to 1936. And one of the founders was Edward Cannady. This led me to Beatrice Morrow Cannady, who was the associate editor and later editor and publisher of The Advocate from the mid-1910s through 1936. She married Edward Cannady in 1912. I had had some familiarity with Beatrice from Oregon Public Broadcasting's Oregon Experience episode and the Oregon Encyclopedia entry on her. As I began to learn more about her through additional research in The Advocate and her 2010 biography by Dr. Kim Mangan, which was published by the press, I began making more and more connections, direct and indirect, between Cannady and these students, as well as other students from the Portland area who enrolled in other Oregon colleges and universities. And those other schools included the University of Oregon, Reed College, Pacific College, which is now George Fox University, and Willamette University. So who was Beatrice Morrow Cannady? Some of you may be familiar with her, but she was many things: a journalist, a lawyer, a musician, civil rights advocate, mother, but perhaps most importantly to our discussion, she was an unwavering advocate of education. Her journey began in Texas, where in 1889 she was born in the small Black community of Littig, east of Austin. According to the Handbook of Texas, it is one of the oldest Black communities in the state, founded in 1883 by former slave Jackson Morrow, who happened to be Beatrice's grandfather. Beatrice graduated from Wiley College in Marshall, Texas in 1908 and later studied music at the University of Chicago. Beatrice came to Portland in 1912 and soon married Edward Cannady and became the assistant editor of the Advocate. That began an association with the newspaper that lasted 24 years. In 1914, she helped to establish the Portland branch of the NAACP and on several occasions protested the showing of the racist film Birth of a Nation. In 1922, Beatrice graduated from the Northwest College of Law, now part of Lewis and Clark College, the first Black woman in Oregon to earn a law degree. As assistant editor and later editor and owner of the Advocate after her 1930 divorce from Edward, Beatrice tirelessly reported on and promoted Portland and Oregon's Black community. She maintained a small lending library in her home, and in 1922 began hosting interracial teas to promote better race relations. Beatrice also gave lectures on racial topics at churches, schools, colleges, and other venues, often to predominantly white audiences. Lincoln High School in Portland and Reed College were two of her favorite lecture venues. In March 1927, she also spoke at Oregon Agricultural College on the topic, What It Means to Be Black in Oregon. I would love to find a manuscript of that particular lecture. Beatrice ceased publication of The Advocate in 1936 and soon thereafter moved to Los Angeles, California. In California, Beatrice was active socially. She remarried, and according to a 1948 California Eagle article, owned a dress shop. And she died in 1974 in Los Angeles. If you're interested in learning about Beatrice Morrow Cannady, I have two suggestions. The first is the Oregon Encyclopedia entry by Dr. Quintard Taylor, and you can see the URL for that on the screen here. And the 2010 biography by Dr. Mangan, published by the OSU Press, A Force for Change, Beatrice Morrow Cannady and the Struggle for Civil Rights in Oregon, 1922 to 1936. The book is out of print, but it is available in area public libraries, academic libraries, and used bookstores, and should be available through Abe Books, which is an online bookseller that includes selling used books. So there are several connections, direct and indirect, that I've made between Cannady and the 7 OAC students. Portland and Oregon's Black population was very small in the early 20th century, and Black Oregonians numbered a little over 2,100 in 1920 and just a little over 2,200 in 1930. Most lived in Portland. Beatrice Morrow Cannady likely knew many of them personally, or at least knew of them, and many of these families knew each other. Beginning in 1922, Beatrice hosted interracial teas at her home as a means of promoting racial harmony. Marie Maxwell, the mother of Maxine Maxwell, one of the 7 students, sang at the very first interracial tea in 1922 and at another one in 1927. Members of the students' families, or even the students themselves, may have participated in the teas, which also included college and university officials and faculty. There were undoubtedly work connections. Many of the families had members who worked as railroad porters or at the Portland Hotel. Edward Cannady worked at the Portland Hotel, as did Richard Bogle after he left Oregon Agricultural College, and Jessie Grayson, the mother of Jenny Dora Grayson. Between 1923 and 1931, Beatrice wrote about the students in the Advocate, such as the mention of the 5 students coming home from OAC for Thanksgiving in November 1924. Unfortunately, we don't know what Beatrice reported in the Advocate in 1922 leading up to the enrollment of Halsell and Otheda Nichols because we don't have extant copies of the newspaper. Advocate reported on events and social activities involving members of the families. A couple of examples are the Payne family hosting a radio party for the OAC co-ops in December 1924, and Richard Bogle's family hosting a party for Carrie Halsell after her graduation from OAC in 1926. Krista Lee Maxwell, an older sister Maxine Maxwell, reported on news for Port Bethel AME Church for the Advocate in the late 1920s. Now, as I've mentioned, Beatrice was a strong proponent of education. She promoted education through lectures, as I mentioned, at churches, high schools, colleges, and in articles and editorials in the Advocate. She also had an extensive personal library focusing on books about Black people and the Black experience. And she lent these books to high school and college students, including University of Oregon student Celestia Brace. Oregon Agricultural College and the Advocate seemed to have a good relationship. OAC regularly ran ads in the newspaper. The earliest identified is 1923, but they could have been earlier if we had copies of those earlier issues of the Advocate to look through. And we also have one from 1925 that you can see here. OAC ran these ads, and OAC regularly invited the Advocate to OAC events such as the dedication of the new women's building in May 1927, OAC's commencement in June that year. The first of the 4 students to enroll at OAC studied commerce. The Benkei Walker Business College in Portland was highly regarded in the Western U.S., but would not enroll Black students, even with Beatrice advocating for them. Catherine Bogle, who later became Richard Bogle's wife, recalled being discriminated against by Benkei Walker and not being able to enroll there. Beatrice may have encouraged the students to enroll at OAC instead, which had a thriving school of commerce. Cannady made trips to the University of Oregon and OAC homecoming games in Corvallis and Eugene in the late 1920s with high school students and some of the OAC students. Specifically in 1928, the game was at OAC in Corvallis, and her contingent visited Maxine Maxwell and Delia Coleman, both students at OAC at the time. Another connection is that Beatrice loved music and was a very good musician in her own right, as I have mentioned, having studied music for a period of time at the University of Chicago. All 5 of the Portland and Salem women who attended OAC were excellent pianists and/or vocalists. OAC had a highly regarded conservatory-type music program in the 1920s, and Beatrice may have encouraged the students to consider OAC because of this. Paul and Lillian Jeffries Petrie took over the music program at OAC in 1924 after having taught at the Ellison White Conservatory of Music in Portland. One of the other instructors at that conservatory was Ethel Turner Rand, who happened to be Otheda Nichols' piano instructor throughout her high school years. Unfortunately, there is no extant correspondence between Cannady and the students, nor did the students' academic records at OSU reveal any letters of recommendation from Cannady. Regardless, the evidence seems to point to Beatrice Morrow Cannady personally knowing all of the students and having a close relationship with some of them and their families. Because of her stature in Portland's Black community, she wielded considerable influence, and I believe this extended to the students' choices of whether to pursue higher education and which college or university attend, especially those institutions in Oregon. So what became of the students? Carrie Halsell and Othita Nichols, as I mentioned, started at Oregon Agricultural College in 1922 on September 18th. Both were commerce majors. Let's talk a little bit about the environment that they entered into. At the beginning of their college careers, Oregon was in a nadir of race relations. The Ku Klux Klan was on the rise nationally, particularly in states such as Oregon, Indiana, and Texas. 2 days after Halsell Nichols started at OAC, the student newspaper, the Daily Barometer, ran an ad announcing a Ku Klux Klan meeting in Corvallis. You can see that ad in the slide. On October 14th, just a month later, both the OAC Barometer and the Corvallis Gazette-Times report on the previous day's march of 4 members of area Klan units from downtown Corvallis to the campus YMCA, which was on the site of the present Memorial Union. This Klan contingent donated $235 to the YMCA and offered more, quote, if your drive falls short, end quote. They stated that, quote, we appreciate the work that you are doing and we are behind you, end quote. And on November 7th, Walter M. Pierce, shown in the previous slide, who was a longtime member of OAC's Board of Regents, was elected governor of Oregon with significant support from the Ku Klux Klan. So this was the environment that Carrie Halsell and Othita Nichols encountered during their first term at OAC. And even a year later, the Barometer ran ads on October 17th and 18th, 1923, asking student Klansmen to come to the west end of the Benton County Courthouse at 8 p.m. on the 18th and to, quote, bring your card, end quote, meaning their Klan membership card. But on the positive side, Halsell and Nichols attended their business classes in the college's newly opened Commerce building. Both lived off campus when enrolled. Halsell roomed in a house at 763 Jackson and seems to have lived there the entire 4 years she was at OAC. By spring term 1923, Nichols was living in Waldo Hall, rooming with Jenny Dora Grayson, who entered OAC that term. In her 1978 oral history interview, Catherine Hall Bogle stated that Nichols and Grayson went to OAC because they could not get on-campus housing at the University of Oregon. Their student records reflect a typical course of classes. Nichols took gym classes, though Halsell was exempt from them and took language classes instead. Nichols took a piano course in the spring of 1923, her freshman year, and in April was one of a group of students who were among the first to broadcast over the college's radio station, KDFJ, which had gone live in January of that year. KDFJ became KOAC in 1925, which today is part of Oregon Public Broadcasting. Nichols played the Andante finale for Left Hand Alone by Donizetti Leschetizky. She performed on the radio station again in the spring of 1924. And I wonder whether Othita Nichols was the first Black resident of Oregon to perform over what is now Oregon Public Broadcasting. Nichols left OA in the spring of 1925, though Carrie Hall completed her degree and graduated in June of 1920. And Othita Nichols happened to attend her graduation. Also was one of the senior speakers at the OAC Cosmopolitan Club banquet at the Golden Pheasant Restaurant in downtown Corvallis. The Cosmopolitan Club was probably one of the first clubs on campus to involve students of color, particularly international students that had been attending OAC since the early part of the 20th century. Halsell was also honored at a dinner party in early July in Portland, given by Mr. and Mrs. Wasson. and the party's colors were orange and black, which had been OSU's colors since the early 1890s. After graduation, Carrie Halsell lived in Portland and worked as a maid at the Meyer and Frank department store. In 1927, she was hired by Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute in Petersburg, Virginia. That is now Virginia State University, as the assistant to the registrar. And she may have also taught business classes as well. At Virginia Normal, she has helped to establish the school's chapter of Delta Sigma Theta, a sorority dedicated to public service with a focus on the Black community. In 1932 in Oklahoma, Carrie Halsell married Lewis Ward. They moved from where they had been living in Langston, Oklahoma, to South Carolina in 1935, where Lewis taught agronomy at South Carolina State College. In 1945, Carrie began teaching business courses there, retiring in 1968. Carrie Halsell Ward died in South Carolina in July of 1989. Althea Nichols attended OAC through March 1925, the end of the winter term of her junior year. According to the March 29th, 1925 issue of the Advocate, she had accepted a position as a shorthand instructor at the Kansas Vocational School in Topeka, Kansas. It was founded in 1895 as a place for Black students to learn agriculture, mechanical arts, and domestic science. Nichols had spent her childhood in Nicodemus, Kansas, one of many Black communities founded after the Civil War by former slaves. So she was certainly familiar with that state. She married Earl Odell in Topeka in 1927, and by 1930 they were living in Los Angeles. According to that year's census, Althea was working as a bookkeeper at a furniture factory, and Earl was working as a chauffeur. In 1932, they had a daughter, but unfortunately, Althea passed away in early June 1942. According to her obituary, she had studied music at OAC and taught music at the Kansas Vocational School. The 1950 census lists her daughter, Althea Jeanette Odell, living with her maternal grandparents, who would be Althea's parents, in Portland. Jeanette attended Washington High School, and in 1951, she was attending the Vanport Extension Center, now Portland State University. Jeanette, therefore, was maintaining the family college tradition that had begun with her mother. Jenny Dora Grayson graduated from Portland's High School of Commerce in January 1923 and entered OAC in March 1923 for spring term. Like Carrie Halsell and Althea Nichols, she was a commerce major, though she had changed to home economics starting with spring term 1924. Grayson and later Delia Coleman took their home economics courses in this building. It appears that Grayson lived in Waldo Hall the entire time she was enrolled at OAC, rooming with Althea until Nichols left OAC after winter term 1925. Grayson was also a musician, and in her early teens had studied piano with Eva L. Graves in Portland. At OAC, she performed at an international banquet in December of 1925. Grayson completed her home economics degree at the end of fall term 1927 and graduated in June 1928. In 1930, Grayson was serving as the acting secretary of the Williams Avenue branch of the YWCA. Jenny Grayson's mother, Jessie Coles Grayson, had helped to found the branch in 1921. Beatrice Morrow Cannady had adamantly opposed the creation of this branch due to it being segregated. It was established for Black residents, and Cannady saw that as a continuation of Portland's of Jim Crow culture. Nonetheless, the Williams Avenue YWCA became a focal point of Portland's Black community. The Grayson family had come to Portland in 1908 from Southern California, where they had been considered a pioneering Black family. The Graysons returned to the Golden State in 1936, perhaps to seek better economic opportunities during the Great Depression. Jenny Grayson's mother, Jessie Coles Grayson, was an accomplished and popular vocalist. While living in Portland, she studied with renowned voice teacher J. William Belcher, gave regular recitals, and sang at many church and social functions. She also worked as a hat checker at the Portland Hotel. After the Grayson family's return to Los Angeles, Jessie had a noted Hollywood career, first singing in choirs for movie soundtracks, and then acting on stage and in at least 14 films, including Little Foxes, which starred Bette Davis, and I think was released in 1941. And Jessie Coles Grayson died in 1953. The Grayson family was part of the Black Society of Los Angeles, and they had membership in social organizations such as the City Cousins Social Club. In 1937, Jenny Grayson was elected secretary of the Outdoor Life and Health Assistance League, a benevolent association, and according to the 1940 census, she was working as a social worker. In October 1940, she married Sterling Wagner of California. So Sterling served as a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army during World War II. In 1944, Jenny was working as a payroll clerk, and in 1950 was the proprietor of a gift shop, and husband Sir Sterling ran a shoe repair shop. I cannot find any evidence that they had any children. Jenny Grayson Wagner died in March 2000 in Los Angeles. Idris Williams graduated from Jefferson High School in Portland in the spring of 1923 and entered OAC also as a commerce student the following fall. She was one of 22 OAC women selected during the spring of her freshman year to participate in the finals of a collegiate-wide spelling contest. During her sophomore year, she sang second alto in the college's Madrigal Club, pictured here. While at OAC, Williams lived in this home at 560 Tyler Street, just north of downtown, owned by longtime OAC faculty member Frederick Berchtold. Unfortunately, she withdrew from OAC during the winter term 1926, her junior year, due to illness. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis and spent time in and out of hospitals until her unfortunate death on November 10th, 1927, at her home in Portland. Williams' funeral was held at Zion AME Church in Portland. Richard W. Bogle was from a prominent Black family in Portland that had earlier helped found Walla Walla, Washington, where Richard was born in 1904. The Bogles moved to Portland in 1910. Richard Bogle graduated from Franklin High School in 1924 and enrolled as a pharmacy major at OAC that fall. Richard Bogle Polling Hall, a temporary dormitory constructed during World War I for male students enrolled in the Specialized Army Training Corps. And from what I understand, it was not a great place to live. He belonged to the Western Club and was one of the living groups within Polling Hall. Richard Bogle was also a good athlete. He had been commended for his prowess as a track and field athlete at Franklin High School, and at OAC, he played intramural basketball on the Western Club team. He was also in ROTC during his freshman year, which I find interesting given that the U.S. military at the time was segregated. Richard Bogle also participated in the OAC Pharmacy Club, which in November 1926 visited the Blumar Frank Drug Company in Portland. Richard Bogle withdrew from OAC in March 1927 at the end of winter term of his junior year. According to Catherine Hall Bogle in her oral history, Richard ran into many, quote, obstacles, end quote, at OAC. Did not elaborate in the oral history what those obstacles were. After leaving OAC, Richard worked as a bellman at the Portland Hotel and later worked for 30 years for the U.S. Postal Service as a letter carrier. His hiring by the Postal Service was not without controversy and barriers. Catherine Bogle again recounts that Richard had qualified for a letter carrier position based on a qualification exam, but when he went in person for the final interview, was told there had been a, quote, error, end quote, and that there was not an opening. Distraught, Richard later ran into a former OAC classmate and told him of the situation. The classmate, who apparently knew the postmaster, interceded on Richard's behalf, and a few days later, a new position came open and Richard was hired. Richard retired from the U.S. Postal Service in 1978. Richard and Catherine Bogle were both active in the Portland branch of the NAACP, Richard serving as treasurer and vice president of the chapter. Catherine worked as a social worker and as a journalist for several Black newspapers. Richard died on May 7, 1979, and Catherine died in August 2003. Their son, Richard Jr., attended Oregon State in the 1980s and later worked as a policeman, became a prominent print and broadcast journalist in Portland, served as a Portland City Commissioner, and was an expert on and aficionado of jazz music. Maxine Maxwell graduated from Salem High School in 1927 and entered Oregon State College in the fall of 1928 to study pharmacy, but withdrew in March 1929 after her second term. Maxine lived in Waldo Hall, where she was a member of the Wanema Club, and she was involved in the campus YWCA. Her mother, as noted earlier, was vocalist, and her father, Charles, was a Salem caterer and barbecue restaurant owner. Maxine enrolled in the University of Oregon in the fall of 1929 to study physical education, but was involved in a major controversy over student housing. She had applied for and been accepted for housing in Susan Campbell Hall, one of the U of O's women's residence halls. Her application did not indicate her race, and when she arrived on campus at the dorm, she was informed that there had been a mistake and that there was no available for her. She was advised to live with Nellie Franklin, another Black student from Portland who lived 10 blocks from campus. Maxine and her parents protested and appealed to the governor's office. The governor, Isaac L. Pearson, deferred and said that this was an issue for the State Board of Higher Education. The incident was reported in several Oregon newspapers, including The Advocate, and other newspapers in the Western U.S. picked up the story. The Corvallis Gazette-Times on October 2nd ran a dig against the University of Oregon, stating, quote, "The university has not been so discriminating, however, at all times. If Maxwell was a good fullback, she would have had no difficulty," end quote, "getting dorm housing." And this was a reference to the two University of Oregon Black football players from Portland, Bob Robinson and Chuck Williams. Maxine ultimately withdrew from the University of Oregon on October 4th. After the incident, she moved to Southern California, where she may have enrolled in Los Angeles Junior College. The rest of her family relocated to Los Angeles in 1932. Records indicate that Maxine worked as a waitress and by early December 1936 was engaged to James Lund. For the 1940 census, they had married, with Maxine employed as a school cafeteria worker. Details of this are scant. In her father's 1956 obituary, her married name was Jones. Maxine Maxwell Jones died on July 31st, 1987. And if you were interested in more about Maxine's troubles at the University of Oregon and the housing discrimination that she ran into, the University of Oregon Special Collections and University Archives published an excellent blog post in 2016 about Maxine's encounter. And you can see the URL there. And I've included a screenshot of the blog post. It is definitely worth reading. Delia Coleman also entered Oregon State in the fall of 1928 as a home economics major, though she had taken classes during the college's 1928 summer session. She was classified as a sophomore, having earned college credits at Hampton Institute and Kansas State Agricultural College prior enrolling to OAC. Coleman may have been in Corvallis as early as spring 1927. This photo shows a birthday party for Charles Wagner, seated on the left, attended by his staff. He was the owner of Wagner's Restaurant, a popular eatery in Corvallis at the time. Standing in the back is a woman who is likely Delia Coleman. The number 11 red arrow is pointing to her. She lodged with Wagner's cook, Guy Munger, family starting in 1929 and likely through graduation in 1931. In this photo, Munger is seated with the number 9 arrow pointing to him. I've not been able to identify the Black person seated next to Munger. According to the 1930 census, the Mungers and Coleman lived near Harrison Boulevard and 3rd Street in Corvallis. This is currently the site of a McMenamin's pub. Coleman lived in Waldo Hall her first year and likely roomed with Maxine Maxwell. Both were members of the dorm's Wanema Club. Coleman took classes during the 1928, 29, and 30 summer sessions and graduated in June 1931 with a BS in home economics. Her student academic record lists her guardian as Mrs. Ida C. Rice of Uniontown, Alabama. This is likely an older sister, Ida Coleman Rice, who was a highly regarded teacher in that community. After Coleman left Oregon State, we know little about her. The January 1902 OSU Alumni Magazine indicates she was living in her hometown of Uniontown. A 1932 USDA publication lists Delia Coleman teaching food-related courses at the Georgia State Industrial College for colored youth. The Great Depression made it difficult for many to be steadily employed, and Coleman was no exception. Many colleges and universities, including Oregon State, laid off large numbers of college faculty and staff and cut wages for others. In November 1933, Coleman, living in Springfield, Illinois, wrote W.E.B. Du Bois this handwritten letter, seen on the left here, asking his assistance in helping her find a teacher's agency that could aid her in locating a teaching position. In the letter, she lists her qualifications and work experience and her willingness to teach other disciplines other than home economics. But she also stated that colleges and universities she applied to either wanted a graduate degree or did not have funds to hire faculty. Du Bois did reply, but he stated that he didn't know of any teachers' agencies and advised her to write directly to schools. In 1934, Coleman was at the Bishop Tuttle Training School, part of St. Augustine's College, a private HBCU in Raleigh, North Carolina. The Tuttle School's mission was to train young Black women in religious leadership and social work. Admission required a bachelor's degree, but we don't know how long Delia Coleman remained enrolled in this school. Coleman's student academic record lists 7 transcript requests between 1930 and 1937 for OAC student academic record. But after finding this Tuttle School reference, the trail on Delia Coleman ran cold. In a piece that Beatrice Morrow Cannady wrote for the February 5th, 1929 issue of the Oregon Journal, she mentioned Jenny Grayson and Maxine Maxwell as other students who had graduated or were attending other universities in Oregon and elsewhere. Undoubtedly, Cannady influenced these and other Portland and Salem area Black students to seek higher education opportunities. Some of the other students who may have been influenced by Cannady to enroll at Oregon colleges and universities included Bob Robinson and Chuck Williams, who I previously mentioned, Nellie Franklin, whom I also previously mentioned, who interestingly later became Cannady's sister-in-law, Beatrice's oldest son, George Cannady, who attended Willamette University, where he excelled in both academics and athletics, Myrtle Maxwell, older sister of Maxine, who studied at the University of Oregon's School of Social Welfare in Portland, and Levada Maxwell, another one of Maxine's sisters, who attended Willamette University. After Delia Coleman graduated in 1931, there is no record of any Black students enrolling at Oregon State until the mid-1940s, when William Thibault of Baker City came to the college. The financial difficulties of the Great Depression significantly curtailed enrollment at Oregon State College and other higher ed institutions in Oregon. Given the already limited employment opportunities in Oregon for its Black residents, this may have also disproportionately limited higher education opportunities in the state. Another factor could be the lack of an encouraging voice after the Advocate ceased publication in 1936 and Beatrice Morrow Cannady left Portland for Los Angeles around 1938. 3 of the 7 students who attended OAC in the 1920s graduated. 3 others nearly completed their junior years of study. 5 of the 7 students were able to live on campus for at least part of their time at the college. They participated in clubs, intramural sports, shared their musical talents, and in the case of Richard Bogle, participated in ROTC. 5 of the students ended up leaving Oregon, with 3 ultimately relocating to Southern California, as did Beatrice Morrow Cannady. But though there was a 12-year lapse between Delia Coleman's graduation in 1931 and Bill Thibault entering state in the fall of 1943, these 7 students, with the support of Beatrice Morrow Cannady, laid the groundwork for future Black students such as William Thibault to enroll at Oregon State. I see we're running a little bit short of time. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the sources that I used, but I want to make sure that there is plenty of time for questions. So why don't we move right into that?
Hey, Larry. Thank you so much for sharing that wealth of information with us. I know that you just said that you want to give time for questions, and I definitely want to provide that as well. But I'd be curious to know a little bit more about where you got your sources. Are you able to still share that slide with us and maybe just take a quick moment to talk about it? Because
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
that the other Pie nerds might want to know.
Sure, sure. Well, the slide I have is I did a lot of research online, particularly newspaper research, and yes, I use Ancestry.com, which had a wealth of information pertaining to census information and other sources as well. And yes, I use newspapers.com. But I did a lot of on-site research at both Oregon State University and the Oregon Historical Society. At OHS, I used the Beatrice Morrow Cannady scrapbook, the oral history with Catherine Bogle, and looked at a variety of photo collections. All of these collections together provided significant content. At OSU Special Collections and Archives Research Center, the student academic records for these 7 students were invaluable. They either confirmed existing information or provided new information. And many of the OSU historic publications are available online through Oregon Digital, which is the joint OSU U of O digital collections platform. Yearbooks, general catalogs, the alumni magazine, and student and faculty staff directories all provided useful information that, again, either verified other sources or filled in many gaps.
Sure.
So it was, again, a lot of online research with multiple visits to OSU and a very long and productive afternoon at the Oregon Historical Society.
That's awesome. Since this program is a little bit about stepping behind the curtain and seeing what this history, this research looks like, it's really, I think, important to highlight those sources and the fact that you had to pull from so many different places to kind of put this story together. I appreciate you taking a second to demonstrate that.
Well, I think that
Yeah.
what this shows is really the boon that digital technology has been to doing archival and historical research. I ran across the exchange of letters between Delia Coleman and W.E.B. Du Bois by happenstance. They're at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I was
Sure.
I was totally blown away to be able to find those, but it was a key piece of her story,
Mm.
particularly the difficulties that she encountered in getting employment during the Great Depression.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That was something else that I wanted to point out, that I really liked how, this presentation was definitely focused on Oregon history, but it also gave those moments to show how they all connect, like the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois was brought into, what she was dealing with, or the fact that, some of these people had family in Texas that were starting communities there as well. I appreciate that you were able to kind of fill in all the gaps as much as you could anyways,
Oh yeah,
this sort of
there
thing.
was yeah, the connections are literal, almost nationwide.
Mm,
With Nichols having grown up in Kansas and returning there for a period of time before moving to California. I wish I had found some evidence that the students interacted with Beatrice Morrow Cannady when they were all after they
sure.
were all in California, but I did not find anything like that,
Oh, yeah.
unfortunately.
That would have been nice. I like to imagine them all meeting up for coffee or one of those interracial teas, down
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
California
Sure.
after what she was able to do. Okay, that's great. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that information. One of the questions I want to ask before I get to the ones that are in the chat is, in what ways did your findings meet your expectations, or how are they different?
Um, this met my expectations and in some ways exceeded them. I just learning so more about these seven individuals and learning more about Oregon Agricultural College during the 1920s. I thought I knew a lot, but I learned a lot more as a result of this research. Uh, so I think it helps put everything that I know about that time period at what is now Oregon State University, into a different perspective.
Mm,
And I'm thrilled that Carrie Halsell was not the only Black student to attend during the 1920s. But
yes.
on the other hand, even though some of them were allowed to live on campus, they participate in certain activities. Uh, we know there had to be barriers nonetheless,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely. Okay,
some
go
of them
ahead.
were able to overcome those barriers.
Mm.
Some, unfortunately, were not.
That is, all too common of a story, especially here in Oregon.
Hmm.
But I'm actually curious about, what they would have been doing during this time. So Zachary Stocks, our executive director, had a great question, of course, which is, what kind of classes would an OAC commerce major have taken? And what job opportunities might a Black female college graduate be eligible for with a commerce degree in the 1920s? So kind of connecting to what you're just saying.
Well, I think they would have taken a whole range of. Man, I wish I would have made a few more notes on a couple of the transcripts of the students, but they
Mm,
were taking a whole range of business courses. Obviously,
sure.
some practical appli- applied courses such as shorthand and note taking and typing.
Right.
But they would have been taking. Uh, they would have had to have taken basic accounting courses, just the general curriculum that any business student would be taking.
Mm,
I think for women, the opportunities were more toward what used to be called secretarial work. And I think
sure.
that's evidenced by Carrie Halsell's uh, being hired as the assistant to the registrar at um, the Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute, and Othita Nichols being hired as well in a similar capacity at the Kansas Vocational School. And certainly the courses that Carrie Halsell began teaching at what is now South Carolina State University, uh, she was teaching she was teaching typing in shorthand.
Mm.
So the opportunities were there, but they were certainly more limited, and I think that was certainly gender based.
Absolutely. That also kind of leads perfectly into the other question that we got by Laurel Christic, which is Is there evidence that Cannady was especially interested in Black women getting college degrees compared to Black students in general? Did you see anything like that?
No, because I think several of the students that went elsewhere were males.
Right.
I think I really didn't look at it in terms
Sure.
of more influence on female students. Uh, it could be in the case of OAC, she was encouraging them to, particularly the students that study commerce, to study commerce because of potential opportunities, uh, albeit limited, post
Mm,
graduation. And the fact that they couldn't get into that premier business school in Portland because they were
right.
black.
Right.
So I don't know what the breakdown of the enrollment at that gender enrollment at that college was, but
Sure.
I'm sure there were a lot of female students attending it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I know that personally, as a woman of color, I'm gonna imagine that she was,
Hmm.
helping to create the next cohort. I mean, she definitely was, whether or not it was just for Black women. She clearly influenced like that first cohort of Black students, which is just incredible to see. So, yeah, thank you for adding to the complexity of Beatrice Morrow Cannady's story and the fact that she was able to um, have influence in an area that she cared so much about in that education sphere, on top of all the myriad things that she did for our community. So that's really awesome to fill in those pieces of the picture. I also kind of wanted to ask if what your next research directions would be from here, if you had time, where you would try to what you try to uncover.
On this particular topic or another
Yeah.
topic?
On this particular topic, though, I'm sure you have many ideas you'd like to dive
Oh,
into.
endless number of topics that I like to explore. For this topic, one of you know I- one of the sidebars that I mentioned was Jenny Dora Grayson's mother, Jessie Coles Grayson,
Right.
who was in 14 Hollywood films,
Yeah, that was
and
very exciting.
I have already rented her as an Oregon Encyclopedia entry. Uh,
Oh, awesome.
so the editorial board of that, or the in chief, will be considering that. I suspect that they will accept it. Um, I'm not necessarily the one to write it. I did
Sure.
suggest Zachary,
Oh, okay.
and as well as another editorial board member on the Oregon Encyclopedia, who's written a number of entries about the film industry in
Mm,
Oregon. Um, so, I mean, if they want me to write it, I'll do it. But I think uh, others should have the opportunity to do that. Uh, but I'm happy to share the research that I've done and point to other sources. There's actually a photo collection and a manuscript collection at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, pertaining to Jessie Coles Grayson.
Oh,
So there
wow.
are movie stills from the photo collection is movie stills from her time in movie productions, and the papers are scrapbooks that I think may cover her time in Portland as well. So that,
Oh.
unfortunately, they're not digitized, so it would
Mm.
require on-site research. But I would love to see those.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and who knows what might be in them? There could be information that relates directly to what we discussed tonight. Um, yeah,
True.
I read through the collection guide, but it was relatively brief, so I don't know. But sometimes you can find hidden gems, as we know.
Yeah, that's definitely something that, people find doing this research. So I'm glad that you mentioned that too. And then finally, just real briefly, if you don't mind saying, like, how has what you've uncovered changed our understanding of history? Whether that's locally or specifically about Beatrice, however you kind of want to frame it. I'm just curious what you
Well,
think.
in doing the research for this episode of Black History Quest, I mean, I obviously I looked at a lot of different sources, but I did not find much in the historical record in terms of publications about Black students and higher education. So I think
Sure.
that is an area that is really, shall we say, ripe for additional research. And not, I'm not talking just at OAC, I'm talking about higher education generally, because there were references in the advocate to students attending Southern California, University of Southern California, and other universities outside of Oregon. So I think kind of looking at that larger picture and uh, and kind of pulling all of that together, I think would be really, really interesting.
Absolutely. Well, I guess maybe that's something we'll have to do in the next episode that you're our history investigator. If you'll, come back. We'll see. We don't have to discuss it
Sure.
now, but
Yeah.
um, thank you so much, Larry. I'm sure that we could wax poetic about this for a long time, but I'll
Oh
go
yeah.
ahead
Pretty good.
and stop us here. But yeah, thank you so much for being an incredible resource for us as an organization and to just sharing this information with everybody tonight. I know that the fellow Pie nerds like myself definitely appreciated it. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mariah, for being a great host. I greatly appreciate it. And thanks again to the audience for joining us this evening.
Yes, thank you so much, Larry.
All
I'll see you soon, I'm sure. Well, that will do it for this episode of Black History Quest. As always, we want to make sure to thank the audience and thank the Roundhouse Foundation in Sisters, Oregon for sponsoring this show. Learn more about them and the projects that they support at roundhousefoundation.org. And then, of course, Oregon Black Pioneers depends on the support of ordinary people like you who believe in sharing the stories of Oregon's Black history. If you enjoyed this show or any of our previous versions of it and would like to support it and others like it, please consider a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers using the link below. If you have any questions about this episode or want to become one of our next history investigators yourselves, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org. And then, of course, stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest in May, where, as always, we'll try to answer the question, how can one source change history? Thank you so much for joining us and have a great night.